the Get Back idea. Let's start with noting that Paul McCartney, as we've said before, was in many ways responsible for the sort of big conceptual ideas in the Beatles. Paul was the one who was responsible for the Sgt. Pepper concept album idea. He was responsible for the idea of the Magical Mystery Tour. He's the guy who wrote the song Yellow Submarine, which ended up being the idea for the movie, although the Beatles had very little to do with the movie and Paul had very little to do with its development. Still, he was kind of the idea guy. And what we're going to see this week is there are two of his big ideas that figure large in 1969. The first is another idea that unfortunately harkens back to Magical Mystery Tour, but is even less successful than Magical Mystery Tour was. And that is this film that ended up being released as Let It Be. And then there is the big idea of the second side of Abbey Road and putting all those tracks together to create a kind of larger version of A Day in the Life. But instead of going just 5 minutes like A Day in the Life did, putting together fragments, it goes the whole side of a record. So those two big Paul ideas are going to figure largely into our discussion. So let's talk about the Get Back idea. Here was the idea that Paul had. Beginning in early January 1969, the band would be filmed writing and recording a new album, as well as performing the songs live for the first time. So in many ways, Paul was imagining a kind of a documentary of, what was certainly arguably the most famous pop music rock band in the world, starting from just the first rehearsals and songwriter kind of discussions and arrangements and that kind of thing, through the rehearsals, through the recording, the laying down of tracks, and then the performing of the album itself. And so this is what that project, this is what they launched to in January of 1969. During that month, they recorded over 30 hours of music and over 90 hours of film. So there is a lot of extra music and a lot of film hanging around somewhere, unless it's been destroyed, that was never used. They brought in to direct this project. Now here's the improvement on Magical Mystery Tour. Magical Mystery Tour, they tried to do themselves. They learned they had to bring people in who actually knew how to make this kind of a film. And so they brought in a fellow by the name of Michael Lindsay Hogg. Michael Lindsay Hogg was American-born, but his father, at least, was a British expatriate. And he was in the UK, had been a television producer for one of the famous one of the well-watched television shows, Ready, Steady, Go. So he knew how to do popular music television, and he'd done the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus in 1968. He directed that, in which the Rolling Stones and John Lennon and Jethro Tull and the Who, all these groups sort of performed in. You may well know, have seen that video before. So coming to the Beatles to do this project, he was already kind of one of the in guys with, pop music, video, television, film, that kind of thing. An interesting sidelight to Michael Lindsay Hogg is it actually turns out that he's the illegitimate son of Orson Welles. And of course that played absolutely no role in the Beatles story here at all. It just turns out that in the last couple of years he's brought out his memoirs, and he always suspected it was the case because Orson Welles had been sort of in and out of his life the whole time he was growing up. But he sent the draft of his autobiography to Gloria Vanderbilt, so the story is told. And she said, "Oh yes, well, your mother never wanted to tell you, but here's the story." And she actually was able to confirm this. So an interesting kind of additional movie connection here with the Beatles, although, as I say, this is very much a kind of aside and not really germane to our talk. So we get into the Get Back project again. The band with the Get Back project really intended to get away from the heavy overdubs of the previous records, really striving for a rawer and simpler sound. I think this is important because, remember, I spent a lot of time talking about the White Album, talking about Paul's maybe kind of looking to the past, this idea of sort of getting back to what they were before, when it was just four guys and Mal and Neil going around in a tour bus just having fun playing music and being good friends. I think that's my own interpretation is I feel that's what Paul was longing the Beatles could become again. And I think it manifests itself in all kinds of ways in '69, and especially in the second side of Abbey Road, which we will get to in due time here. But John was on board with this. So it wasn't entirely Paul. And the idea was to get away from all of the high production that they had been doing. In fact, one story is that John Lennon had a little bit insulted George Martin in the way that he informed George Martin of this new direction, basically saying, we don't want any of that studio stuff you've been doing for us, as if he didn't appreciate all that George Martin had done for the group. Anyways, the idea was to get back to the roots, to get back to a raw, simpler kind of sound, to get back to their rock and roll roots. So the move away from psychedelia that we talked about on the White Album is really, this is just one more step away from what Sgt. Pepper had done. We're starting to see with this Get Back project. So after a month of work, a week in the Twickenham film studios, and then moving everything to the Apple studios in their Apple headquarters, they just gave the whole thing up. It wasn't working out, and they decided to give up the Get Back project entirely and just do a regular album. And at that point, they call George Martin in and talk him back into producing a record, doing it the way they always did in the past. And we'll get to that when we talk about Abbey Road. But anyway, so we've got a month's worth of tons and tons of music and film. Now, Michael Lindsay Hogg went back and edited that film and came up with a version of it that was released in May of 1970. Interestingly, the Beatles won an Oscar in 1970 for Best Original Song Score, so that's a little bit better than things went with Magical Mystery Tour and on that front anyway. The movie was originally meant to be a TV documentary, as we said before, accompanied by a performance, but it ended up becoming a feature film. Good luck finding it now, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, while this film was supposed to capture the band's creative process, it ended up chronicling a breakup. That's one of the reasons why it's was controversial with the Beatles themselves, because it really didn't show them in a lot of times in their best light. There's a famous clip that, to their credit, they included in the Beatles anthology that has Paul and George kind of going at each other during a rehearsal, and certainly there was a point when they were at the Twickenham studios where George Harrison just, he got into a fantastic fight with John Lennon that Lindsay Hogg didn't end up using. Some rumors were that they actually traded punches, although that was denied. But anyways, George quit the group, but then he came back into the group, and so you can see this was like a kind of a Beatles meets Spinal Tap kind of thing going on as they were trying to do this. One great thing about it is that they did, when they were still thinking they were going to finish this project, they couldn't find a place to do the big concert at the end, right? I mean, these guys were not promoters, and I guess they didn't realize that you got to give people more than a week or two's notice to do a big concert in a big venue. Oh, really? So they ended up doing it on the rooftop of their Apple office building on the afternoon of January the 30th, 1969, and that ends up getting captured in the Let It Be film, and the best parts of it really do appear in the Beatles anthology as well. It's funny because the Beatles are up there playing. I'm sure you've seen these clips, and there are people sort of around. This is sort of the business district, the finance district of London, and people are sort of looking up, and they realize there's music coming from the top, and they figure it must be the Beatles up there. So people are going up these buildings and fire escapes, and they're trying to get a look at the Beatles as they're performing. Finally, a couple of London bobbies come in, and they tell them they're going to have to turn that music off because it's disrupting the neighborhood and all that kind of thing. And Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr have both said what they hoped would happen was that they would be arrested and carted off in the paddy wagon, do. Perfect ending to the film, right? Beatles arrested in rooftop concert. But Ringo says to his great disappointment, all they did was basically just say, now you turn that music down. And so the thing ended maybe in not the most dramatic way. But nevertheless, that concert is really the last live performance we have of the Beatles all together. That film has been unavailable since the 1980s, when video cassettes first came out. There were plenty of copies of it on video cassette. I can remember watching it back then when VCRs were the new technology of the day. But plans to re-release it have been postponed. There have been various announcements that maybe they would release it and maybe they wouldn't release it. But the problem is that it brings up a lot of old issues, and you know, I suppose at some point we'll be able to see the original theater cut and maybe the director's cut of it if Michael Lindsay Hogg is still around when Apple allows it to be released. But for many reasons, the failure of that can be, the failure of the Get Back project can be measured by how resistant the Beatles and the Beatles organization has been to re-releasing that movie, even though they would almost certainly have a top seller on their hands. It brings us to the issue of an issue that maybe we can step aside for just a second and have a look at what it means to study history of a particular group, especially when the people who are in the group are still alive and telling their story. I'm sure that many of you watching this have seen the Beatles anthology videos, and if you get the book that you can get, the Beatles anthology book, that's all those interviews that you see in the Beatles anthology, but the unedited version. So you can, there's conversations go on. It's full of fantastic interview material. It's really, really worth having. But I think as historians, we have to look at what the Beatles are doing and not casting any aspersions, but just their acting. Paul, George when he was alive, Ringo, Neil when he was with us, all working to kind of control the spin on the Beatles' legacy. And the Beatles anthology is a fantastically rich resource, but it's not the last word, because in many cases, those guys are describing the situation as they understand it and as they remember it having happened. But there are plenty of times in the anthology when 2 or 3 different Beatles remember the same event different ways. So like taking testimony in a court trial, people can see the same accident and they come away with different descriptions, see the same crime, they come away with different ideas of who did it, this kind of thing. The same thing goes with studying history. It's interesting that the Beatles anthology tries to, I think, finesse this Let It Be project, gives you a lot of the good parts of the Let It Be movie without maybe some of the other parts that they didn't want to have. So you do get almost a kind of a abbreviated version of Let It Be. And it draws our attention to this idea of being aware, not so much wary, but being aware of the way in which historical figures, while they're alive, can try to control the spin or control the reception of what their work means. They have an idea of how they want to be remembered. It's only human, it's only natural. It's very, very tough for anybody to be completely objective. And so I'm not casting, as I say before, I'm not casting any aspersions on the Beatles in any way, but we as historians have to keep our eye out for that kind of thing. And this thing about Let It Be in the anthology, you know, that really brings that point out in an interesting way. Well, let's talk about the singles that came off of the Get Back project before we get into the actual tunes themselves. Even though the Get Back album had been abandoned, singles from the sessions were released in 1969 and 1970. So as I mentioned in the last video, we get Get Back in April of '69 as an A-side, backed with Don't Let Me Down. We get Ballad of John and Yoko, which actually was recorded a little bit later than these January sessions, so maybe it doesn't fit quite as well, although it's pre-Abbey Road. We get Let It Be, which is released in March of 1970, with You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, a track that I think was actually recorded back during the Sgt. Pepper days and was just kind of hanging around. It's interesting because in many ways people see Let It Be as being, because of when it was released, as being the story, the song that basically tells the story of letting go of the Beatles thing, you know, Paul's moment of resignation where he just says, you know, okay, if it has to go, then it has to go, let it be. And then the B-side is a sort of a zany, fun-loving Beatle pastiche of them back in the days when they used to be having so much fun together. It's almost like a movie flashback. And when you think of it that way, it's a bit of a tearjerker if you like the group. And then finally, The Long and Winding Road, of which more we'll talk about in the next couple of videos. That's from May of 1970. So those are the singles that get released around the Get Back project. Well, let's have a look at now the album that came out of the Get Back project. So that's the album Let It Be. That's what we'll talk about in the next video.